Good afternoon, everyone, or indeed good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Please, can I ask, if possible, for you to keep your cameras on, but your microphones off for the duration of the speakers' talks. Welcome to this inaugural event, Race, Anti-Racist Internationalism and the Global Colour Line, hosted by the Department of Law's Anti-Racist Working Group. My name is Tanzil, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the working group, and this event has been co-produced along with my colleagues, Dr. Roxana Banu, Professor Ratna Kapoor, and our events manager, Gulsh Khatun. The Anti-Racism Working Group came together in the summer of 2020, following the mass Black Lives Matter protests around the globe. And it focuses its activities on three goals: decolonising the curriculum, supporting and promoting an anti-racist legal pedagogy, and making material interventions as a community of university teachers and researchers outside of the university. The murder of George Floyd in May 2020 signalled a global reckoning with the perennial issues of race, the racial and racialization. Emboldened by the organising of Black Lives Matter and the struggles against police brutality in both the global south and the global north, within universities, workplaces, schools, professional sport clubs, and even the ranks of government, anti-racism appears to be forming a new common sense. However, this stands in stark contrast to the growing influence and increasingly normalised far-right capture of the state in different parts of the world. Against this conjuncture, we invite some of the world's leading public intellectuals to share their understandings of race, racism and racial politics to help us make sense of this moment and how we might imagine another world. This prompts us to ask some fundamental questions. What critical and analytical space might we lose if we describe the recent displays of racial violence simply as discrimination? What do we even mean by anti-racism? Is decolonisation a useful term? How might the processes and structures of racialization and exploitation be disrupted? Ultimately, is a post-racial world even possible? The conversation will also reflect what role universities must play in disrupting processes of racialization within and beyond these four worlds. This event brings us together with three fantastic speakers. So the format of today's discussion will first invite each of our speakers to talk for around about 15 to 20 minutes each, starting with Professor Gurminder Bambra, then Professor Denise Ferreira de Silva, and then finally Professor Sora Han. My co-organisers, Professor Ratna Kapoor and Dr. Roxana Banu, will then offer some questions to our speakers for about 10-15 minutes before we open it up to a Q&A to everyone else. So our speakers really don't need any introduction, but I'll offer a brief one nonetheless. Gurminder Bambra is a professor of post-colonial and decolonial studies in the Department of International Relations in the School of Global Studies, University of Sussex. She was elected as a fellow to the British Academy in 2020. Previously, she was a professor of sociology at the University of Warwick and has held visiting and guest professorships at Linnaeus University, EHESS in Paris, Princeton, and the University of Priscilla. She is also affiliated with Remiso, Linköping University in Sweden, as well as being the author of several books, including Rethinking Modernity, Post-Colonialism, and the Sociological Imagination, for which she won the 2008 Philip Abrams Memorial Prize for the Best Book in Sociology, and Connected Sociologies, published in 2014. She's also edited 4 collections and is a series editor of the Theory for a Global Age series, now published with Manchester University Press. Gurminder is also the director of the Connected Sociologies Curriculum Project. An academic and practicing artist, Professor Denise Ferreira de Silva's work addresses the ethico-political challenges of the global present. She is the author of Toward a Global Idea of Race, a De Vida Impagável, forgive me for the butchering of what I assume is a Portuguese language, and Unpayable Debts, which I understand is forthcoming in 2021, in October of this year, with MIT Press. She's also the co-editor, along with Paula Chakravarti, of Race, Empire, and the Crisis of the Subprime. Her work has been published in leading interdisciplinary journals such as Social Text, Theory, Culture, and Society, Social Identities, Philosophia, Griffith Law Review, Theory and Event, The Black Scholar, to name a few. Her artistic works include the films Serpent Rain and Four Waters Deep Implicancy, forgive me, in collaboration with Arjuna Neumann, and the relational art practice Poethical Readings and Sensing Salon in collaboration with Valentina Desiderio. She has exhibited and lectured at major art venues such as the Pompidou Centre, Whitechapel Gallery, which is just up the road from our offices at Queen Mary, the Guggenheim, the MoMA, and she's also written publications for major art events and published at art venues such as Canadian Art, Texte zur Kunst, and eFlux. And finally, we have Professor Sora Hahn from the University of California, Irvine. Sora is an associate professor in criminology, law and society in the School of Social Ecology, as well as the director of the Culture and Theory PhD program. Her research interests are in slavery and American law, critical theory, race, gender, sexuality studies, and psychoanalysis. And she's the author of the fantastic book, Letters of the Law, Race and the Fantasy of Colorblindness in American Law, published with Stanford University Press. In Letters of Law, Sora asks, how should we understand the notion of colorblindness in the face of enduring racial hierarchy in American society, and argues that colorblindness is a foundational fantasy of law rather, that not only informs individual and collective ideas of race, but also structures the imaginative capacities of American legal representation. So I'm sure you'll all agree, a fantastic collection of speakers that we've got to listen and learn from today. So I'll begin by handing it over to Gurminder, and then Denise and Sora will follow straight thereafter.
Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation to speak on this panel today. The issues that you raise within it are both sort of very urgent and long-standing. And so what I'd like to do in the time that I've got is to look at the way in which W.E.B. Du Bois has conceptualized some of these issues, and to think through what we can learn from a closer engagement with his work in this context. For those who may not be aware, Du Bois was free-born in 1868 in Great Barrington in the northern state of Massachusetts. This was 5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation had begun the process of abolishing slavery across the former Confederate states, and it was 3 years after the end of the Civil War in the US. Du Bois graduated in 1895 with a PhD from Harvard University, becoming the first African-American to do so. He had a long and varied career, throughout which he was deeply engaged with scholarly and political problems of his time. So he's somebody who's sort of both an incredible academic, but also very much invested in the politics of the times that he lived through. And what I'm going to do in the talk today is trace the movement in Du Bois from his conceptualization of the color line in the US to his later arguments regarding the construction of the global color line through colonialism. And much of what I'm going to set out today draws on the co-authored book, Colonialism and Modern Social Theory with John Homewood, which has just been published. So Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk came out in 1903, and it redefined the terms of interaction between African Americans and those Americans of European descent. It started by pointing to the significance of the color line as being the most fundamental issue of the 20th century. The stultifyingly slow march of progress since emancipation, as Du Bois set out, required analysis of the dead weight of social degradation that was borne by all African Americans. And here what he's pointing to is the system after slavery that was then established of segregation, and then goes on to become the Jim Crow system after Reconstruction. In the first essay in the book, what Du Bois does is ask the reader to reflect on what it means for African Americans constantly to be regarded as a problem in the world, both from the perspective of white Americans, but also from their own self-understanding as African Americans living under that reality. He goes on to ask what it means to see oneself only in the terms by which others see you. And Du Bois diagnoses this condition as one of alienation, which produces for African Americans both a divided self and a double consciousness. It's a peculiar situation, he writes, and I'm quoting, "This double consciousness, one ever feels his two-ness, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings. Du Bois locates this sense of two-ness as a product of the history of the nation and its institutions of slavery and segregation. While emancipation had been presented as providing the possibility of resolving the division, this hadn't happened. The nation, he states, and again I quote, has not yet found peace from its sins. The freed man has not yet found in freedom his promised land. Now, some have seen an echo of Hegel and the master-slave dialectic in Du Bois's framing of the problem, but the dialectic of freedom in the US is unresolved. It doesn't follow that which has been set out previously by Hegel. Du Bois's discussion of double consciousness is fully aware of the fact that white Americans do not understand themselves to be self-limited in their relation to those that they had enslaved. From the perspective that Du Bois is developing, the issue of double consciousness is that the generalized other represents a racialized order which could only be internalized by African Americans in the form of a divided social self, with the me projected onto them by white Americans being radically different from the me that they understand within their own community. Further, white Americans live neither as divided selves nor in recognition of their own self-limitation, nor do they recognize how they limit others. Indeed, as Du Bois argues, they do not see those others. So in these respects, in his work around double consciousness, we can see that what Du Bois is doing is developing a form of standpoint epistemology. However, unlike the standpoint of the proletariat in Marx's account, for racialized division, there is no necessary dialectic that brings a resolution to a contradiction that exists on both sides of the relation. And it's in part because the oppressed group in this context doesn't constitute an emerging majority. So what Du Bois is confronted with is a situation of a deep injustice that's being done by the majority to a minority, and with there being no self-development on the part of the majority for the address of that injustice. This is compounded by the fact that the universal language of rights through which that majority understood itself was implicated in the very production and reproduction of that injustice. From presenting, and I'm aware I've sort of presented this in quite truncated form here, and very happy to sort of pick up on questions from this, but I just want to shift because it's in 1903 that he starts by presenting the color line as the defining issue of humanity. But by 1945, in his book Color and Democracy, Du Bois is now suggesting that the abolition of colonialism should be considered the most profound issue requiring address. And so in the next section, I just want to set out the basis of this shift. In 1944, there was a conference held at Dumbarton Oaks to discuss the establishment of the United Nations. Du Bois was present at this conference, and in his discussion of the proposals that were being made at it, one of the things that he was keen to highlight were the racial inequalities that continued to structure, or that structured the new organization. He pointed, for example, to the inconsistency of those countries which were accepted as members. Many of the free states represented in the assembly were not really free. For example, Canada, Australia, and the Union of South Africa were closely integrated parts of the British Empire. Their inclusion was compounded then by the exclusion of a significant proportion of the global population, namely, and I quote, those 750 million colored and black folk inhabiting colonies owned by white nations. In addition, questions around the future of the colonies and the treatment of colonial peoples came under the purview of a committee that had no power of action. And Du Bois's strongest criticism of this conference rested in the fact that there was no serious attempt to address the long-standing issues of the colonial system and of modern imperialism. From at least the time of his participation in the Universal Races Congress, which had taken place in London in 1911, Du Bois had argued for the need to consider the disenfranchisement of African Americans, the subjection of India, and the partition of Africa within a common framework of analysis that was predicated on the solidarity of peoples of color. While the United Nations was seen to be set up to establish a government for men, as Du Bois argued, and I quote, under this proposal, something between 1/4 and 1/2 of the inhabitants of the world have no part in it. no power of democratic control, and scarcely an organized right of petition. So in the book Colour and Democracy, what Du Bois is sort of setting out is a really keen understanding of the broader histories of colonialism and the extractive relationships through which colonizing countries had not only existed, but thrived. And he further draws the link between the depletion of raw materials in colonial areas and the seemingly paradoxical continued desire of empires for colonies. And he explains this by arguing that colonies today are areas for the investment of capital in which the investor can make a rate of profit far beyond that which comes to him from domestic ventures. So what's going on here is the fact that profit at home is being limited by the demands of organized labor for higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions. And Du Bois is trenchant in his claim that the colonial system is part of the battle between capital and labor in the modern economy. But he's also prescient in his analysis of the ways in which the colonial organization of the world is also implicated in the situation of the working classes in colonizing countries. And he writes that when working people within European countries began to demand costly social improvements from their governments, the financial burdens of this were balanced by increased investment in and extraction from the colonies. So what Du Bois is explicitly making a link between is the way in which the welfare arrangements within many European countries was funded by continued colonial extraction. And in this context, he argues that the problem of democracy is located in the poverty in which the majority of people live. The poverty of those who've been colonized, the poverty of the smaller nations, but also the poverty within colonizing countries. And until these issues are addressed across the board, there can be no satisfactory development of the democratic ideal. So having set out sort of Du Bois's work on the colour line, his understanding of colonialism and the need for anti-colonialism, I want to draw the analysis into the present. And in part, we can see how over the last few months, the ways in which inequality structures the world have been have been highlighted to a great extent. From the different consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic within countries to the disparities in vaccine rollout between countries, from politically organized hostility towards migrants and minorities to the escalation of violence that produces refugees, from the elite capture of an ever-increasing share of global wealth to a global increase in poverty and destitution. And indeed, the interconnections between growth and depletion that are foundational to environmental degradation and climate catastrophe. The inequalities that mark and shape these examples are not internal to countries or situations, but they transcend borders and limits. They're global, both in terms of their contemporary configurations, but also in terms of their historical constitution. And as a consequence, they can't be adequately captured in cross-national analyses or analyses on within country or between country differences. But if we look at the work that sort of is dominant within the field of global inequalities, we see that the focus of much recent work on this topic, such as Branko Milanovic, who sees global inequality as the sum of all national inequalities, or then if we look at the work of Thomas Piketty, who similarly organizes his historical comparative analysis in terms of inequality within nations, and yet the political entities he's discussing were rarely nations over the longue durée, they were empires. And it's important to think about whether an entity was a nation or whether it was an empire, because it has consequences for the way in which the state itself comes to be defined, both in terms of its contemporary boundaries, but also its historical constitution. And the way in which we define the state is central to the shaping of politics in the present. Among many other things, what is key is that it defines who can and should be considered the legitimate object of public policy for the redress of inequalities. And here I want to sort of step back to one of the things that Du Bois noticed, and that was the fact that it's an imperial and colonial dividend that is integral to the construction of post-war welfare states. And especially in the period that Piketty calls their Trente Glorieuses, this is the period that the welfare states in Europe established themselves and are seen to have their period of 30 years of development, growth, and the extension of welfare. And it's precisely that period where they're also active in depressing the economic activity of their colonies and soon to be former colonies. And the direct and immediate inequalities related to these actions have established longer lasting patterns of global inequality, which I suggest can't be adequately analysed without taking these connected histories into consideration. From the high point of European empire through to the demise of empire, European states have always invoked welfare as central to their domestic legitimation. But what scholars have failed to do is to examine the relationship of colonialism to the development of the wealth that these states have accumulated that they were then able to distribute as welfare. And perhaps more importantly is the issue that the end of empire doesn't bring an end to the legacies of its social structures. The patterns of inequality that shape the world are a consequence of the legacies of empire, and these inequalities need to be understood within that connected frame of reference. I'll end with what I think is needed in terms of how social sciences can contribute to undoing the inadequacies that have been baked into our disciplines. And here what I'm making an argument for is what I'm calling a reparatory social science, a social science that works towards a project of transformation and repair. What this would involve as a first step would be to rethink our disciplines by taking modern empire as the unit of analysis rather than the modern nation. Second, it would be to recognize that what we understand as the modern world is actually the colonial global world. Third, taken together, these would enable us more adequately to contextualize events and processes that are often presented as separate and to understand them within a connected frame of reference, one committed to repair. A reparatory social science provides the space for all of us to be invested in this project, to make a world that works for all of us. The question is, how many of us want a world that works for all of us? So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Gurminder, for those thoughts. I'll now hand it over to Denise.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank Tanzil, Oksana, and Ratna for the invitation to be in this conversation with Gurminder and Sara, and also with all of you. The title of my presentation is the racial question or questioning of justice. When I was considering how to address the questions proposed by the organizers, by the working group, I really have to confess that I could not come up with anything more fitting than something that I actually prepared back in 2019. And that year I presented two versions of it. There was a long one that I presented in London at Workback, and then there was a shorter one that I presented at an anti-colonial conference in Paris. But that was before now. So that was before the global events of March 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic was announced, and of May and June 2020, the protest in the wake of the public execution of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Now that over 500,000 people died in the US and nearly 500,000 people died in Brazil, and over 3 million people have died in the world of this new disease, and now that in Canada, as more are vaccinated each day, the province of Ontario is still registered a proportionally high number of deaths, which are among those who are classified as essential workers, basically Black and Brown persons. Deaths among those whose social conditions, housing, income, health, and employment places, so those social conditions render them more exposed to the infection. And now that they have died due to a level of exposure that could have been avoided or minimized if the province government had not refused to provide sick pay leave protection to these workers. Well, now in light of all that has changed, and actually what has not changed in the past year or 2 years, what I'm about to share with you, I think it deserves to be said again, and I couldn't find any other way to say it. And I start with a quote, which is a question. How many more need to die before this war ends? That question was asked by the Rio de Janeiro City Councilwoman, Marielle Franco. She asked it on Twitter 2 days before she was assassinated in downtown Rio de Janeiro by the police. And I quote again, stop killing our youth, she cried, and she cries in the same Twitter feed. Echoing the call from those who since 3 years ago have been asking who killed her and her driver, Anderson Gomez, asking about who ordered her assassination. And echoing also the call from those who demand justice for the murdered and disappeared First Nations women along the Highway of Tears, and of the children, for the children confined and killed in residential schools in Canada. Echoing those calls, Marielle Franco's cry, forces us to ask, what becomes of the question of justice if attuned to the cries of mothers, fathers, siblings, relatives, neighbors, ancestors, and descendants, their friends and their relations? How is the question presented when it echoes these cries and resonates in each and every particle of each and every inch of air, waters, buildings, streets, cars, beaches, bicycles, squirrels, dogs, raccoons, coyotes, salmon, and trees? Everything, every tiny little bit of matter echoes, cries, heard and unheard. Because this is indeed the case, all that is left is to ask the question. Now, the question does not present itself unmediated. When colonial and racial violence are attended to, taken into account in the account and the description of the scene of the killing, the where, the when, and to whom total violence is done, it removes justice from where it has been located in the past 200 years or so. For colonial and racial violence are authorized by that which protects settlers and citizens, that is the modern juridic apparatus, the structures and mechanisms of law enforcement and administration of justice of both the colony and the polity. For when the demand for justice echoes its failures, it renders it a political question because it removes its ethical basis, that is the principles, equality and sovereignty, those principles that have sustained the reign of the transparent subject and its polities and colonies since its articulation 200 years ago, about 200 years ago. When Blackness and indigeneity are front and center in the articulation of the demand for justice, when justice hailed from its failure, it becomes a questioning, which is what I'm calling the racial question. Now, this is not a presentation of the racial question. It's not even, it's barely an introduction, which is also not more than an outline of what I think must take place before one even contemplates the possibility that justice can be made to actually ought to respond to its failure. Nevertheless, because the starting point was Marielle Franco's articulation of the question never asked, the question for which the call for Black Lives Matter is both an answer and a refusal, the question of how many more need to die. This introduction is also, in a certain sense, a preparation of the question. So it's a bit vague and repetitive, which is a way of inviting you to sit with the question, to wait for it to make sense, to curb the impulse to translate it into an existing familiar formulation. lurking just about every explanation, every justification for police killings and the court's failure to prosecute the murders of Indigenous and Black persons in Canada, Brazil, and so many other places, the racial question awaits attention. How many more need to die? She asked 2 days before she was killed by the same ones, law enforcement agents who had done so many killings in that city. How many more need to die? It's only a rhetorical question until it is linked to the demand, stop killing our youth, Indigenous and Black youth, and brown youth. What's in a question? What already is in this question becomes evident when it is combined with the demand. How many more need to die for the killing of the descendants of yesterday's native and slave to stop? When asked this way, highlighting its historicality, the question recalls that today's Black and Indigenous folks, they are descendants of yesterday's colonial subalterns. And I do highlight it because I want to move the racial questioning of justice from where, I mean, which is where the law, from that place which is where the law reaches it, but is also where it fails, right? Which is that the scene of exclusion and discrimination. And I would like it to move from that scene, and I think here is speaking much in connection with Gurminder's presentation, to move it to the terms such as expropriation and extraction, to be addressed with such terms. But at first, this may seem rather abrupt move to place race, to remove racial subjugation from the juridic into the economic scene. But there is no, it's abrupt, but and then at the same time, it's not also, that doesn't carry a claim of priority. Nor is the emphasis on the continuities between the colonial and the racial some kind of claim of the superiority of the historical over other horizons for understanding. So neither is the case for reasons I have elaborated in some other place, but I can repeat a couple of them here. First, in regards to the economic and the juridic, I think it is important to recall that these, as well as the symbolic and the ethical, they are separated analytically in descriptions of social context, but any critic of modernity knows, and of coloniality, knows that they operate in tandem. So for instance, when explaining the difference between wage labor and slave labor in Capital Volume 1, Marx highlights the fact that the former refers to a juridical relationship of the kind that is established between equal and free entities in the market, like contract. Of course, we know that capital is, among other things, an exposition of why the wage worker is neither free nor equal to the capitalist owner of the means of production. Yes, but this does not mean that theirs is not a juridical relation mediated by, or a relation mediated by contract, a juridical relation in the form of contract. Second, in respect to the relationship between the colonial and the racial, the argument here is not, again, an historical one. The relation is not about chronology, but similarity, in the sense that raciality does not follow coloniality in time, but it figures coloniality in a different register. To recall, the racial refigures the colonial at the symbolic level, which is an argument I'm making toward the global idea of race. And it makes sense if one recalls how the arsenal of raciality, and this is why it is important not to take my argument about racial and raciality as one about race and racism. So if one recalls how the arsenal of raciality was assembled in the second half of the 19th century, and that it has become crucial, also that it has become a crucial item in the modern vocabulary in the 20th century. When the historical rendering of the notion of culture became the main reference of racial difference, of cultural difference, and replaced racial difference as the privileged, as a privileged descriptor for that intellectual and moral difference between European and their others. Something happened in the ways in which racial subjugation was to be accounted. But anyway, it has been precisely in and through cultural difference that the racial has performed its most important political work. That is, which is to delimit the reach of humanity, the privileged post-Enlightenment ethical figure, the one to which the principles of universal freedom and equality applies. That is, the one that is the ethical form of the transparent I, or the transparent subject. From this, it comes, I think, evident how an attention to the racial immediately shows these moments, economic, juridic, and ethical, operating in tandem. But also, and perhaps more importantly, for the work that I think that needs to be done, it shows how inextricably the colony linked the colony and its juridical architectures of total violence, how they are inseparable from the operations of global capital, but that we know. Anyway, not surprisingly, the question Black Lives Matter refuses, and Marielle Franco's question, how many more need to die, presumes, it's never to be contemplated under this overall framework. For one thing, even considering the elements of the question, which would necessarily require an exploration of the relations mentioned above, even considering these elements goes against the grain of any and every post-Enlightenment account of justice. And this is because any consideration of the elements of the question would violate the basic assumptions that sustain the very notion of justice. So the assumption that, because the asking would racially place the presumed subject of justice, that is, he would have a body and a place of origin, and thus he would be stripped off his transcendental cloak. That is, the subject would lose its defining trait as a self-determined entity or as a thing of liberty. And then B, once the subject's speciality, affectability is foregrounded, even if it remains a formal thing, as it is captured by the tools of raciality, its ethical, economic, and juridic moments would also be specialized, and as such would no longer enjoy the abstraction afforded by the Kantian formulation of the transcendental, which is the only reason why they can sustain the claim that universality is the sole descriptor of modern conditions of existence, of its juridic and economic moments, more in particular. Finally, along with universality, the racial questioning of justice, or the racial question to justice, would also unsettle its opposite, particularity, and with it, the whole architecture of knowledge, which is composed of universals, concepts, and particulars, categories that these encapsulate, which are the only possible indicators of identity and equality in our vocabulary. So just to conclude very quickly, the racial questions, the very metaphysical and ontological basis, as well as the concepts and categories that compose and operate as in law and justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those reflections, Denise. Finally, over to you, Sora.
Thank you. I want to echo my thanks and gratitude for the invitation to be part of this conversation. And I'm especially grateful to follow Raminder and Denise here, because my comments are very directly my responses to the questions you all gave us. And in particular, because these questions that you opened our panel today with are questions that are very much sort of driving a kind of reckoning in American law schools today. right? So even at the law school at UC Irvine, where I teach both undergrads, law students, and doctoral students, there is an unprecedented sort of movement within the law school, but sort of the legal academy more generally, to really reckon with the kinds of histories of colonialism and racism that Parminder and Denise have talked about today, and the ways in which those remain uncontested and largely immovable because of the structure of legal academia and the ways that lawyers are trained. So the comments that I'm going to make today are very specific to my own experience and kind of the things that I have witnessed happening in the American Legal Academy. I want to keep them brief because I do want to have a much more sort of concrete discussion with you all who I believe are engaged in a similar endeavor that I think echoes the kind of global movement for Black lives, and a response in the university to the crisis of our political institutions, including the law. So I'll start really literally by answering the questions, right? So the first question is, what is lost when we think of the recent forms of state violence as discrimination? And clearly the most obvious answer here is that the actual violence remains unchallenged, and only the discriminatory nature of law enforcement is challenged if we approach the problem as discrimination. The question of discrimination is always, to me, however, and this sort of builds on the much more theoretical work that I do in my writing, but I'm not going to really be speaking to that today, is an opportunity to enter for legal practitioners, law professors, law students into a liminal moment of challenging the law where there's an opportunity here to either enforce punishment equally or scale back and abolish punishment, because the least of society who experience so-called discriminatory punishment would say that no one should be subject to it, right? So the difference here is taking George Floyd's murder and sort of using that as a way to say that punishment should be rendered equal, and that such excessiveness should, if it's discriminatory, can be made the antithesis of discriminatory if it's subjected on every suspect equally, right? Or the other alternative being that the technique of law enforcement or law enforcement itself be abolished. And that would be a response to the violence, right? So discrimination as it enters as a problem of law is always the choice about equalizing punishment or abolishing, scaling back punishment. The framework of discrimination also presupposes that punishment exists historically and is socially useful as a universal exercise of state powers. And here, Denise's discussion and critique of the transparent subject is sort of undergirds this argument. The neutral, objective, universal context of criminal law especially is reproduced by the framework of discrimination when history and social analysis reveals to us that punishment, of which criminal law is just one genre of a diverse arena of many different types of law, is fundamental to enslavement, racial repression, and colonialism. So 2 points here to this first question. The first is that discrimination must be taught as an opportunity not to reform, but to scale back and abolish. And scale back and abolish particularly sort of punishment and the punitive effects, right? So agencies responsible for any form of law enforcement and policies, laws, and principles that have punitive effects and remedies in response to social crises. And then the second point is that when we think about discrimination and policing, we must link and widen problems of criminal law and procedure with other areas of law so that the problem of discrimination can be politically demoted as a discursive and libidinal point of identification with the law. Okay, so the second question put to us was, what what do we mean by anti-racism? And I don't actually have a really profound answer to this question. It's a term that strikes me as profoundly liberal, which is not in my mind, not a compliment. It's a popular term for those who work in public institutions as well as in the nonprofit NGO world. And it describes a form of public service that challenges in whatever ways either individuated bigotry, unconscious bias, institutional structures that produce discrimination. And again, like discrimination, anti-racist work and advocacy in and of itself is not a problem, but it's a problem when it becomes the dominant way in which subjects in public institutions respond to and think about racism or raciality, either as individuated perspectives or reformable institutional policies and procedures, instead of as a procedure that constitutes the necessity of the institution and its many ways of changing through anti-racist reform. And this is what I think specifically Denise was, allowing us to appreciate sort of at a much more fundamental philosophical level. I never tire of referring audiences who are motivated to think about beyond reform to Derek Bell's work. Derek Bell is regarded here in the United States as sort of the forefather of critical race theory, and referring specifically to his theory of the permanence of racism, and sort of posing the challenge of taking that theory seriously as a first principle or a starting premise of any legal curriculum, thought exercise, or campaign. So at the crux of his theory, which is trying to explain why it is that racism is permanent, okay, thinking about the United States, is the way that he insists upon a theory of democracy that understands that political idea is constituted and dependent on slavery. What does this mean? Democracy does not survive the abolition of slavery. And insofar as democracy is reformed and perfected and survives, so too does slavery and its afterlives. So if you start with that theory for understanding the relationship between law and racism, then anti-racism has the possibility of becoming a radical concept, but suffice it to say, hardly anyone, including critical race theorists, want to truly transform legal education and practice based on his philosophy. This leads to another point that I would put forward for discussion, which is that anti-racism as a liberal critique of racism perhaps becomes a productive concept for thinking through the differences between anti-Blackness and other forms of racism. And I'm thinking in the American context, just sort of recently, the issue of anti-Asian racism during COVID. And the thing that I will just sort of briefly say here on this point is that, when you look at the history of American law, anti-Blackness is sort of irredeemably saturates American law. It makes American law irredeemable, while anti-Asian racism appears episodically. The most recent example we have of this is the fact that the federal George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that was actually initiated in the legislature in 2020, and then it died and was reintroduced recently. That law, does a whole host of things that in and of themselves, very sort of meager if we think about the structural sort of nature of policing and anti-Blackness, but nonetheless, includes things like prohibitions on restraint techniques like chokeholds and restricting the use of qualified immunity. But it's with that piece of legislation that is something that legislators have been trying to push through for almost 2 years now. It has not even reached the Senate for debate. On the other hand, the anti-Asian hate crimes bill recently sailed through Congress and the Senate, was signed into law by Biden a few weeks ago, right? Both bills are sparked by a public recognition of racist violence, but only one actually becomes the law, while the other, again, no radical curtailment of police power there involved, right? will never come to pass, despite the fact that George Floyd's murder sparked a worldwide protest against police violence and anti-Blackness. Is decolonization a useful term? You know, the first thought that came to me, honestly, was like, you know, useful for what? But I, you know, sort of building off of what I've discussed so far on sort of anti-racism and the possibility of extending Bell's theory to rethink how anti-racism has become a sort of dominant liberal response to a structure. We can imagine a similar kind of opening available for understanding decolonization. So you know, something that comes to mind was 2 summers ago, I taught an American constitutional law course at Korea University in Seoul. And, you know, I had to think really hard and long about what and why Korean law students would be interested in learning about from American constitutional law. This was at a time when it seemed that there was actually much more progressive movement on the Korean Constitutional Court than the United States Supreme Court, which Trump was stacking with arch conservatives. And I decided that I would focus on the history and jurisprudence of the Civil War amendments. This is the 3, you know, radical sort of amendments to the American Constitution following the Civil War, and following the sort of abolition, the formal abolition of slavery, and teach them that there's a way to interpret the US Constitution as an anti-slavery constitution. When others outside the United States look at the US Constitution, they should look at it as a remnant of the possibility of radical social and cultural transformation, a kind of unborn possibility of abolishing a slave society. And that if read in this way as a constitution to a possible but ultimately unbirthed new democratic order, it was the promise of freedom that really sort of safeguarded this possibility. This, I thought, would be useful to think about how North and South Korean lawyers might have another framework for achieving unification, where unification is, you know, a part of a decolonial movement. And my Korean students, they identified with this, or maybe more specifically, they disidentified with a capitalist democratic constitution and identified with a new constitution or a new legal order promising an anti-capitalist, anti-American freedom that former colonial subjects could forge through their own accord. So I offered that story or example as one way in which in a law school, some other history and some other terms get introduced as alternatives to these terms like inequality, discrimination, that only reinforce this transparent subject that Denise talks about. Decolonization then becomes useful, I guess, from my own perspective, but only insofar as decolonization in Korea, where it's obvious that a decolonial approach to legally traversing the border between North and South is reframed as an extension of abolition. And I'm not talking about police or prison abolition in this context, although these certainly could be a part of the process. Military abolition, I think in Korea, it seems much more like the concrete sort of campaign at stake here, but I'm talking about the ongoing global project of abolishing institutions, ideas, and relations that extend from the United States as a slave society. And one of those like sort of commodities that I think the US legal academy traffics the world over is our Constitution. Okay. is a post-racial world possible? I mean, given what you know about my first book, you would understand that anything that would be offered as the post-racial is a version of colorblindness, and thus would just be reinforcing the kinds of, colonial and racist sort of foundations of law. And I guess what I would say just really briefly on this question is that post-raciality in the United States, slightly different from colorblindness, I think has coincided in the recent sort of 2 decades with an acceleration of extractive processes of human potential and life from Black communities in the United States, immigrant communities in the United States. And so that, I think, is something we're thinking about, and that is work that really structures the terrain where law students will be attempting to make interventions in. How do we disrupt processes and structures of racialization? What role should the university play in disrupting processes of racialization? Again, I have really just sort of, some ideas, only, sort of ones that emerge in the context that I teach and work and research in. They might be different for your context, and I would love to have that conversation with you all. Some ideas. Well, the strategies are as varied as each of our circumstances. Teaching the history behind the laws. This is definitely one of the strategies that we're seeing emerge in the American Legal Academy, that legal education, becoming a lawyer, requires a certain historical knowledge about the law. So the point that I would make here is that we need to teach it so that only a radical transformation of law can offer hope of redressing this history, right? Not a reformist transformation, but a radical transformation. These days, I've been thinking about medical education as another approach to training law students, right? Diagnosing based on whole systems knowledge, palliative care versus cure, always present death as the reason for the profession, and extending these principles to teaching law, litigation, legislation, and legal remedy. We would approach, these questions about their meaningfulness only insofar as they're based on a whole systems knowledge, a legal advocacy that is about offering care and not cure. And if death is our common fate, how does this change our orientation to legal decisions and advocacy? These are some of the things that I think we can start to think about in comparing our sort of professional obligations as law professors and future lawyers. Teaching law collaboratively in settings where law touches people's lives and is actively considered and entered into as a form of thinking about the law. This, I think, is demonstrated in the expansion of clinical legal education in the United States. There's a kind of shift in the resource and the idea of what it means to learn the law. So on a school level, this means transforming the law lecture hall into a free clinic where every sort of ad hoc way of thinking with those who the law is meant to serve becomes a terrain where creative solutions might actually be discovered instead of taught. Teaching abolition is something that I see emerging here in the American law school. I was recently asked to review pieces that Harvard Law Review wanted to publish. Howard Law School made it a requirement for its law students to attend a series of webinars on visualizing abolition. It's an ethical domain of questioning and engagement that is now infiltrating the American law school. And I think that the point here to stress is not simply a kind of, celebration or critique of an ideological shift, but actually to look at the history of law as a place where abolition is a formal part of legal advocacy. Okay, so when we think about various modes of legal argumentation and legal reform, we see that we're training students to strike certain provisions down of laws, to argue for nullification of certain provision, to argue for the retirement of certain laws or the discreditation of certain laws, delimiting the applicability of laws. And so that kind of abolitionist sort of reasoning, working as a lawyer, is something that I find really interesting, sort of coming to the fore in this moment. The crucial issue here will be then also teaching how to resist filling in the holes left in the wake of these always partial acts of mitigation, neutralization, and dismantling. Frankly, the legal catastrophes that we deal with as a part of our liberal political institutions. 2 more points. Teaching legal advocacy as a calling to serve people in need, to articulate it as a form of mutual aid, strikes me as something that is possible now because of the COVID and the ways that people are now engaging their neighbors, engaging their neighborhoods, the lives of people that they live with and near have shifted. And then legal education, fundamentally as a place where we teach problem solving, right? The problem is that teaching problem solving requires getting them to submit to really narrow and legally determined procedures. So when we teach Black studies, when we teach feminist studies, when we teach radical anti-colonial theory in law schools, it's, we need to insist that these are not counter or specialized histories. They're not electives. They're not, certain ideologies that are fringe that we want to move to the center, but they're essential problem-solving techniques. They're the philosophies that allow lawyers to develop essential problem-solving techniques when one, and you will, when one reaches the philosophical dead end of liberal freedom that undergirds every aspect of law and the profession. So just some ideas out there to put out there and to get us started on the conversation. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. Thank you, Soren. Thank you, all 3 of you. I mean, what a thrill. And I wanted to say, I so very much wish that we could have been there and at least given you a big round of applause from all the 90 people in this room, virtual room somewhere. And all I can do is, I guess, just raise my Zoom clapping hand just to say thank you so much. This has been just wonderful. And, I have the role of jumpstarting the conversation, but this is really not to get the audience warmed up because the questions were pouring just as you were talking. So clearly we're going to have a wonderful conversation. And this is more to draw some themes from your talks and your scholarship together and pose 2 broader questions to give us a sense of where the critical project you're developing ultimately leads. So you are all providing this incredible critique of the liberal theories of freedom, equality, and liberty. And it seems to me that it has at least 3 prongs, and you'll tell me if I'm getting any of them wrong. But one of them is to say, let's rewrite the intellectual history on these concepts and engage deeply with marginalized voices like Du Bois and maybe Anna Julie Cooper, just to add a Black female figure that was writing alongside Du Bois. And that would be one part of the critical project. The other one would be to say, move away entirely from intellectual history and try to unearth the much broader history behind the philosophy itself. So in what context have these theories really been put together? And that would be a way of pointing to the cynicism, right, if not perversion of theorizing about liberty, freedom, and equality while the ongoing practices of enslavement and segregation and subjugation were taking place. And then the sort of final stage of the critical project would be to say, well, all this accumulated injustice, because we haven't rewritten our intellectual history, because we haven't moved past intellectual history and so on, then leads to all of this accumulated injustice feeds into our legal vocabulary and constrains it. And so in a wonderful piece, Sora, for example, writes that contract law should be reconceptualized as a law of slavery, and that maybe the practice of contracting should be seen as the catch-all exclusionary category. And so I guess my question is, once all of this is done, let's say that these three prongs of the critical project are underway, does that then lead to still a rethinking, a reconceptualization of the same categories, the same concepts? Is it, so are we then really in the philosophical dead end that Sora was describing on liberty? Or are we then in some kind of different mode of thinking, nevertheless still about liberty or equality or freedom? So is it that the critical project with all these different prongs leads to a revision of the current epistemologies, or a bringing new ones to the core altogether? So that would be just to make you say a little bit more, you know, Gurminder, your repertory social science, is that a way of retooling, rethinking about repair alongside freedom, equality, liberty, or as a different epistemology altogether? And Denise, when you say, let's resist translating these pressing questions into familiar formulations, is that because they cannot be redeemed, or is it because they're not helpful at all, even if we were to redeem them and rethink them? So that's just on the one hand. And the second question, I wanted to, if you could help us just take a moment to think about the context in which we're posing these questions to begin with. So we are, of course, addressing all these pressing questions of racial inequality, but we are still posing them in this very privileged academic setting of the global north. And so I wondered if you could say a few words about how you think these projects of decolonizing various disciplines might be perceived in the global south. So to Sora's point about trying to teach in Korea and giving a different version of the American Constitution, so they're decolonizing the American Constitution might be a useful project. But is there also the flip side? Might this project for decolonizing be seen as maybe even essentializing or even regressive in the global south, because it detracts attention from much more direct interventions into these pressing questions of global economic and racial injustice? So in a way, to take a moment and think about whether there's a critique of the critique, a critique of the decolonizing movement itself, if you will. Okay, so this is, like I said, really just to bring some themes from your work together, and to invite you to say a little bit more. But the big bulk of this is supposed to be the audience jumping in with all sorts of questions and comments and getting the conversation going. And people have already started doing that. Our initial plan was for everybody to just indicate in the chat that you would like to speak, and then we would invite you to unmute your mic so that this could be more of a conversation and you would address the speakers directly. But I'll leave it to Tanzel to decide whether now he's just going to read the questions or ask the speakers to the people in the panel to address the questions directly. But again, the plan would be for everybody to just indicate that you would like to pose a question, and then we would invite you to unmute your mic. So I'll end here just to say this has been wonderful, such a thrill just to have this conversation. I hope this is going to be one of many, many to follow. And thank you so much for joining us.
I don't know if I want to invite our three speakers to maybe respond to Roxana's reflections. So I don't know if anyone wants to go first.
Sure, I'm happy to respond. I mean, I guess what I would say, sort of taking both of the questions together, is really that the call for a reparatory social science is a call for a transformation of the way in which social science has been done. If we think about the way in which the disciplines have emerged, they've emerged in the context of a reflection upon what they have understood to be the emergence of the modern world, to a large extent within the social sciences. So the idea of the modern world that comes into being requires a set of disciplines in order to understand what is modern about this world in comparison to what was traditional. But those disciplines in their original sort of formulations never take into account colonialism as a central structure of the emergence of the modern world. The modern world is situated in terms of the French Revolution and perhaps the US Revolution in terms of the political changes that occur, or then the Industrial Revolution, which is seen to be the cotton mills of Manchester and not the plantation system or the systems of sort of empire and slavery that preceded. So in that sense, arguing for a re-understanding of modernity as being about colonial modernity and not just modernity forces us to think again about the disciplines that have been established on the basis of a historical understanding of the modern that refuses colonialism any space within its conceptualizations. So to take colonialism seriously would then require us to rethink how the disciplines themselves are shaped. And that would force us to rethink the concepts that are then associated with it. So if we think about the idea of freedom, freedom to a large extent, or the ideas of progress, etc. Again, you know, with Habermas in his classic understanding of modernity as an unfinished project. Well, it's an unfinished project tied to an understanding of progress, which is about the completion of the project as seen within Europe, but with no understanding that what occurs within Europe occurs at the same time as the depletion and destruction of much of the rest of the world. So what does it mean to complete a project of in its own terms as progress, but that doesn't recognize that Europe's progress is dependent on the unmaking of the rest of the world, the destruction of the rest of the world. So if we're going to have an understanding of modernity as colonial modernity, then that unfinished project can't be a project of modernization. It would have to be a project in the way that Nelson Maldonado Torres talks about, that it's an unfinished project of decolonization. That would be the project that enables us to repair the world and move beyond where we currently are. And so in that sense, I would argue for a transformative account, not just something that's new, but that takes on board what is, works through it, and develops something different in relation to an address of the problems as they've been identified by taking colonialism seriously.
Denise, I don't know if you want to respond to any of Roxana's questions.
Yes, it's interesting. I don't think I can. I don't think I can add anything to what Gurminder just said, though. So I would just respond just differently, but the content or maybe the orientation of my response would be very very similar. So but let me just say it in a different way, and then maybe that's it's a good thing for the conversation itself. I think in regards to the first question, which is more like a provocation, it's a good provocation, because you, Roxana, are really asking us how, I think you're asking about the limits and the uses of critique itself, right? And from my perspective, I think critique is fundamentally limited because it's an exercise that takes for granted the very ontopstemological infrastructure that which includes these concepts with liberty, equality, freedom, etc. The very ontopstemological infrastructure that it is constituted by the racial or raciality. So the critique is always short of being a racial critique. And I thought is always short of actually doing precisely what Gurminder is saying needs to be done, which is exposure of the ways in which the modern is contingent upon, dependent on, and is, couldn't be without colonial extraction and expropriation. No, so I think the call is, and we can call it decolonization, we can call it, I don't know, but the call is a call for, I think facing, at least from my point of view, for facing these limits, the limits which are the limits of those concepts, and begin again. Now, there is a risk. I mean, it's very risky, especially because our imagination is so limited by the options posed by liberal thought itself. So there is the risk, there is an inherent risk of being maybe either plagued by what has always been the order of liberalism, which is fascism, right? So that's what I'm talking about. I mean by talking about the imagination, and or there is, maybe the risk of just coming up with some kind of radical liberal alternative towards already liberals, which is a way of reading historical materialism, for instance. So anyway, let me just say that I think the work has to be done at different levels, not only at the theoretical, analytical level, which is where the critique plays. I think there is some work at the level of the imagination, and then of course the practice. I think Sora and all of us, I mean, we talk about and we engage. As to the second provocation about the decolonizing being something that makes sense from up here, up north. I don't think, I mean, if in Latin America, well, I'm more familiar with Brazil, of course, but in Latin America, we find both the old anti-colonial project was there. It's been there for a long time, not only the anti-colonial project when those places were colonies in the late 18th century and early 19th century, but also the anti-colonial projects of the 20th century. Some versions of the project were produced over there. I can see how this new figuring of the colonial project is also very much present. Then of course there are other aspects of the ways in which it is deployed or actualized in different institutions, not only the university, but also museums and other institutions that may take some particularities over here that we won't find, or in Europe, that we won't find necessarily in places like Brazil or Peru. But yeah, I think it has become another global signifier, a global term. Well, yeah.
Thank you so much, Denise. Sorry, I just want to give you an opportunity to respond to Roxana's provocations.
So, I guess in terms of what Gurminder said about exposure and the role of social science to expose certain things, I'm starting to feel like in our culture of social media and in the globality of the scale of capitalism, of this sort of these extractive economies, exposure, I feel like exposure is insufficient. And I think that it is very much actually a part of the way that the law perfects itself. So I am much more partial now, I guess, and I've been really thinking about these things during the pandemic and in respect to sort of my own research and these conversations that Denise and I have been having for years now about, remedy. And this is, so I want to sort of, I know that many of my concrete sort of suggestions about certain ideas that I see on the ground here in the United States in the Legal Academy and certain things that I've been part of is one way to respond in a certain location, right? But I also want to put on the table other traditions of legal advocacy, we might say, that have never sort of been incorporated into how we think of law or teach law, for that matter. One of them is something that I have a long-standing sort of relationship with and involved in various organizations that now kind of broadly come under the term abolition feminism, where, and again, this is problem solving, right? If we think of lawyers as problem solvers, and abolition feminists are problem solvers. They're problem solvers when it comes to addressing the forms of violence that saturate our lives, right? And rejecting state-based solutions, as well as thinking through the limitations of the interpersonal confines of the various relationships that produce forms of violence in our lives and that continuously reproduce them. And so in that context, right, problem solving is very much a thing, very much a knowledge that we do not actually draw from in meaningful ways when we think about then a formal legal strategy. So I would, I can't say anything sort of, generalizable about what the strategies might be. It really depends on where you are located and thinking about these problems. I also think that, and this kind of goes to, Denise's work and your, engagement with the problem of imagination and how we foster and sustain that terrain of knowledge and of relating and doing. I recently saw this amazing work by Charles Gaines, an American artist who does various things, but he's working with the actual text of the Dred Scott opinion, the 1857 Supreme Court opinion that said that Blacks who are not citizens cannot be citizens, writes them outside of any kind of political ontology. This artist, used the text of that opinion, which is hundreds of pages long, and created a musical score. The artwork is called Manifestos 4, he did in 2020. I think that, the catastrophe of law is on the scale of COVID. It's on the scale of climate change. And so our strategies as people who critique the law, who work within the law, who are advocates, needs to contend with the scale of the catastrophe and understand that that things like resolution, things like, a kind of final word are completely irrelevant when it comes to legal practice today. And that what we're talking about is mitigation. We're talking about neutralization. We're talking about survival. We're talking about finding spaces where we keep imagination alive, we keep certain socialities alive. I mean, this is what, to me, at the end of the day, a history of the racism of law or the colonial project of law needs to, sort of, I guess, translate that theory into the reality of our circumstances. And when we switch the aim of why it is we turn to law, then we are left with these things like mitigation. We're left with how we care for one another as opposed to a cure. And in that space, then perhaps there might be strategies that we can then generalize. But until then, I don't really, I would like to just defer to other people having a discussion amongst us.
Thank you so much for those responses, Gurminder, Denise, and Sora. I'm going to now open it up to our participants to ask questions. And just so we hear different voices, I'm going to ask. I'm going to call upon them and ask them to ask the question and direct it to a particular speaker or speakers. And if it's okay with our speakers, I'll take a couple of questions at a time, just so we can get as many in as possible. So AJ, can I ask you to unmute your mic and ask your questions, and forgive me for misspelling your name.
No problem at all. Thanks very much. And thanks everyone for this wonderful panel. My question is for Gurminder, and it comes from just the early point you made when you first started speaking that I hadn't thought about before. You were talking about how the problem Du Bois was facing is different from the one that Marx was facing on the basis of, confronting the minority problem as opposed to a majority problem. So I was wondering, two parts, could you say a little more about the differences kind of strategically when you're coming from a minority population versus a more majority population like the working class? And then the related piece to that is, I'm wondering if we look at the jurisdictional level of individual United States, where so many of the laws are kind of enforced, it strikes me that African Americans have, at least historically, I don't know contemporarily, been majority populations despite that. So I'm wondering if there's something happening at the state level, the federal level in the United States that kind of obfuscates the power of the majority population in any smaller jurisdiction, if you know what I mean. Thank you.
Thank you, AJ. Leila, if you want to ask your question as well, please.
Thank you so much for all the presentations. Mine is very general. It's basically just a question because all of the talks touched upon the how colonialism and capitalism are intrinsically linked. And I wonder what the implication of that is. Does that mean that we can only abolish one if we abolish the other? And what it means for decolonial knowledge production? Does it have to be anti-capitalist? Does it have to essentially involve or entail the unmaking of the capitalist mode of production and the global division of labor between the global south and the global north? So just thinking through the relationship between decolonization and capitalism.
So maybe if I can ask our speakers to respond to those two questions first, please. So maybe Gurminder, if we start with you.
Okay, great. Thanks for the questions. I mean, Du Bois is obviously writing without having read Marx at that time. And so he's developing an understanding of double consciousness, which some people have then tried to sort of work into a Marxist understanding around standpoint epistemology and so on. And I think what I'm pointing to in part is that the way in which Du Bois comes to conceptualize the idea of double consciousness and what he comes to understand as the problem of the color line, even though it might have resonances with a Marxist understanding of the standpoint of the proletariat, in his own terms, it's quite differently conceptualized. And in part because I think when he talks about the majority and minority, he's talking about it in terms of race across the US, and he's looking at the position of African Americans specifically in terms of the US as a whole. And if we think about what he goes on to write, he's as well as being a sociologist, he's a historian, an economist, and all sorts. He's sort of multidisciplinary in the work that he does. But one of the key things that he's interested in is what happens during the Civil War that enables the Emancipation Proclamation to be established. And what happens is what he calls a general strike by African Americans who down their tools and literally leave the place of production, which was the plantation, and migrate north. And so his understanding of sort of thinking, but they still remain a minority in the context of the whole, and there's no possibility for the majority, which is white Americans, to be able to learn about what is wrong in terms of their behavior, because they don't even understand that slavery and segregation is problematic. That's the normal condition against which people are protesting, but that protest is predominantly by the minority. And so in a way, I guess what Du Bois is presenting is this sense of how does one effect change that's a change that would also transform the majority's commitment to what it understands as normal. And again, normal, and so in that sense, I think that while some people have tried to sort of locate Du Bois's work in relation to Marx, or then in relation to Hegel and the idea of the master-slave dialectic, if we read what Du Bois is saying, he's actually carving out quite a distinct position. And the point, I guess, that I want to make in relation to this is that whilst Du Bois starts with race, he ends with colonialism. And so if we look at the trajectory of his work, he starts with the sort of particularity of race in the context of the US and how it configures inequality and oppression in the context of the US. But he goes on to understand that if there is going to be a majority, that majority can only be in the context of the global situation where the majority are the colonial oppressed. And what would it mean to think about colonialism as the structure that produces inequality in the world? And I think that that shift is significant, because it also points then to moments of solidarity and thinking about how we enact politics in the present is a shift away from race towards thinking about the colonial structures that have established the inequalities that we continue to grapple with. And I guess just briefly in relation to the other question that was asked, that for me, decolonisation requires us to understand that there is no way that we can understand capitalism without understanding colonialism as central to it. So this idea that we can understand capitalism as an economic system that exists separately to the political modes that have been established through colonialism is just deeply problematic. And it points to the ways in which we have absolutely misunderstood what capitalism is. So any proper understanding of capitalism would have colonialism integral to it. And by having colonialism integral to it would require us to think about how movements of decolonisation, to the extent that there's been political decolonisation, is one aspect, but what would it mean to truly decolonize would also be to think about those systems of exploitation and oppression that continue to configure the world, and what needs to be done to address those.
Thank you, Gurminder, for your response. I'm going to now call on Shabina. Shabina, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question to the panel, please.
Thank you very much, Tanzil. And thank you very much for all the presenters for these wonderful insights that we've been hearing for the past 1 or 2 hours. I think Gurminder has already tried to answer a part of the question that I was trying to pose. It was basically the the confluence of capitalism, globalization, liberal order, and decolonization. What we talk about decolonization in the present day context, in the present post-colonial world. I was, of course, specifically talking from the perspective of from India, where I am from. So we are politically emancipated, a race, anti-internationalism, global color lines, trying to think about the subalterns that we have today within our own state, within the own political state, all the minorities that we have, all the economically, socially disadvantaged people that we have, so-called state people, but in a state of utter statelessness that we find today. That was basically, I think now Gurminder ma'am actually already tried to answer the strategies that could be there. Where does it fall in the discourse of decolonization? Whether decolonization has actually happened, just in terms of political sense, of course it has, but whether it has been there at the social level, at that was basically the question. I think she's already tried to ask it. Thank you very much. I think Leila already tried to ask the same question. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Shabina. And I think it's equally important to think these questions through and formulate them in different ways. So I think it was important, and thanks very much for asking your question. I'm just going to read the 2 questions from Musharat in the chat, and I assume that this is addressed to all speakers. So Musharat asks, can the global north, he has a question prior to that, forgive me. What are your thoughts on abolitionist ideology of law enforcement versus the decolonizing approach? And can the global north decolonize social science education amongst capitalist patriarchy? Will it just be embedding recolonization? So I don't know who would like to respond directly to those questions.
I don't, well, yes, I think I was going to say I don't want to respond. No, I don't want to answer the questions, but the questions and then the questions before just made me wonder about what do we mean by decolonization, especially thinking of the possibility of decolonization. At which level are we talking about? Are we talking about the epistemological level and if in doing so, then are we, when talking about colonization, are we presupposing separate entities and the relationship of power in which one is occupying another at that level? But then such a description of the situation is already colonial because it's so fundamentally modern anyway. Are we talking about primarily the economic dimension of it? Then yes, then there is no critique of capital. There is no description of capital. There is no anti-capitalist program, which then would not also be an anti-colonial, an anti-colonial project. But what takes to get there, right? Because the very notion of capital it only makes sense with the exclusion of everything that is associated with the colonial. Anyway, and so on and so forth, right? So decolonization is a concept that's been around for a long time. I was joking talking about Brazil and Argentina back in 1815, but even before that. And I think I shouldn't say I think in every generation it seems to gain different elements, and it seems to mean different things. And yet we talk as if we are talking about the same thing, right? And I think it's important not only for this exercise, which is a conversation, but speaking from where I am speaking from the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people, and given the circumstances that are so, especially here in Vancouver, Western Canada is so colonial, so violent, it's unbelievable. Anyone who knows anything about Canada, when you are here, you can't believe how raw the colonial violence is in this place. So then it becomes something else. It becomes about nothing less than giving the damn land back. And because giving the damn land back is impossible, since the land that is being taken is being materialized in everything, including this computer I'm using to talk with you, then we have to really do all the work, because not even, some earlier articulation of the decolonization makes sense of it, but from here now, yeah, anyway, I just want to say that probably because where I am thinking from and standing, it requires more. We need more. I don't know what, because no one person can know what, but I think we need to face the demand for giving the land back. In the end, it's impossibility. Any thinking that begins without from anywhere beyond that or before that, it's just gonna take us back to this place again. Okay.
Thank you, Denise. Sorry, I don't know if you would like to respond to any of the questions, or maybe what Denise has just said, or Gurminder's earlier responses.
Yeah, so two things, and they seem disconnected, although maybe they're not. The first is that I would challenge Gurminder's reading of Du Bois as sort of his move from thinking about the color line and towards colonialism as a move away from race, especially because some of his later writings, he definitely has this worldview of how, there are racial groups, and so the world sort of colonial scene is always also a scene of racial differentiation, in which the idea of double consciousness, we can be sort of creative about how double consciousness actually localizes itself. So double consciousness in the context that I talked about teaching in the, at Korea University, is a kind of double consciousness related to this division of Korea across North and South, right? A communist Korea and a, late sort of capitalist indebted society, militarily occupied society in the South. So I would like to push back on that reading in order to hold on to simultaneously this idea that when we are engaging law, we are engaging its colonial history, we are engaging its racial history, we are engaging its capitalist history, all simultaneously. With the land back, Denise, I mean, it's absolutely urgent. And I think that one of the things that a knowledge or an intellectual history of the law enables us to do is to show how it has become impossible to give land back. And that in and of itself is highly important. How we understand the law to have rendered certain political demands impossible is important, not because then we learn how to undo them, because what it means to understand the history of treaty law here in the United States is to show ultimately that violence and guns and the military will always rule, that essentially that is what the law is. And when we understand how we get to such an impossible place, that understanding fortifies a commitment to continuing and persisting in an impossible demand. And I just want to say that I believe that that is useful, that in and of itself. How that fits into the idea of embedding a recolonization, I don't know. But to me, recolonization is what comes after a certain relinquishing of a persistence in demanding something radically other. And knowing how, the law is this, very kind of capacious terrain of violence is how we persist in that radical desire.
Thank you, Sora. Gurminder, I'm not sure if you'd like to respond to Sora's first point on the reading of Du Bois.
I mean, we're happy to take sort of more questions if you'd like to do that.
Yeah, absolutely, no problem. I'm also just kind of cognizant that it's nearly been about 2 hours, so people may be suffering from screen fatigue. But if anyone does have any questions or comments that they want to pose to our panel, please let yourselves be known in the chat. I'll just give that a few moments. Okay, doesn't see. Oh, yeah, we have a hand. Amal, can I invite you to unmute your mic and please ask your question? Go ahead. Amal, if you'd like to unmute. So I think there may be a problem with Amal unmuting. If you'd like to maybe type up your question in the chat function, we might have to give that a moment or two. If anybody else has any questions, please let me know in the chat and I'll invite you to unmute. And you can ask a question directly to the panel. Okay then, so we seem to have been frustrated by technology there. Forgive me, Amal, for some reason it's not unmuting. But perhaps you can post your question to us and we can pass it off to the panel. Okay then, so I think what we'll do then is we'll bring proceedings to a close. I just want to thank the participants, all of you, for taking the time out to listen to this discussion, this conversation, which is going to be we hope, the beginning of many. I'd like to thank my colleagues as well, Roxana and Ratna Kapoor, Gulsh as well, our events staff, for organising this, and of course our fantastic panelists who offered much provocation and things to think about. So thank you all for joining us. We will be in touch with the recording of the video, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Take care.